Welcome to What Matters Now, the Times of Israel's weekly podcast drilling down into one issue affecting Israel right now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, joined by our senior analyst, Haviv Rettig Gur. Hi, Haviv. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be here.
This week was launched by the news that 6 hostages, all previously thought alive, were discovered dead in a Gaza tunnel. The 6 hostages whose bodies were recovered over the weekend, Hersh, Goldberg-Polin, Yerushalmi, Danino, Alex Lobanov, Carmel and Almog Sarusi, were killed just days before the troops found them, according to the autopsies performed later. They were all buried this week, and hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets on Sunday demanding a hostage release deal now. Haviv, I know that you personally attended one of the funerals, and it makes a lot of sense to me for families of the hostages and their supporters to demand an immediate hostage release deal at all costs. And I think most parents and many others can definitely get behind that thinking. But today, I'd like us to discuss the two sides of this really terrible Sophie's Choice. It increasingly appears to me that the sides are between live hostages returning, and maybe not a lot even, and the second side is future deterrence for Israel. So first of all, Haviv, would you agree that these are the two sides of the Sophie's Choice?
I have to tell you, Amanda, we have polls that tell us amazingly contradictory things. And when you start to parse them out, you discover that Israelis don't think that it's all or nothing. There are very few Israelis who say, for example, we need a deal at any cost. We have to get the hostages out, even if it means Hamas retakes Gaza and we have to fight this war again in 3 years. And there are very, very few Israelis who say, we let the hostages die and don't even try to get them out. We don't even try for some kind of a deal. Nearly everyone is somewhere in the middle. The question is the cost. Are you willing to give this much to get the hostages out? Are you willing to give that much? And the thing that we are asked to give is essentially military relief of military pressure on Hamas. And so the question is, how much military support do we hand Hamas in exchange for hostages? I think the most important thing to know about this moment isn't where the polls fall. We can get into it. We can talk about, how Israelis are thinking through that Sophie's Choice, that torment. It's not a dichotomy of a Sophie's Choice. It's a spectrum, but nevertheless, it is, everybody's having to make the call for themselves. People are moving on this spectrum. People are thinking about it. People are tormented about it. But separately, most people are just pessimistic. Most people don't think it can happen. The basic story is that 33 of the 101, I believe, hostages still in Hamas hands are confirmed dead. And 30 are believed alive and on the lists in the deals being proposed to get them out. The list changed a little bit because of the 6 hostages executed last week. And the rest, we don't really know where they are. The deal on the table is only really about the 30. And it might no longer be on the table. And so Israelis are being asked to write off 71, including the bodies of 33. And so there's a deep, deep pessimism. And coupled with that pessimism, there is the question that always hovers over these debates, which is our government trying? Do we trust our government? We have polls, for example, that Netanyahu's fundamental case, we have to stay in the Philadelphia corridor in the Egypt-Gaza border, or Hamas rearms, resupplies. And by the way, if it rearms and resupplies freely because we're out of there, then more soldiers will die, arguably, than the number of hostages we get out, because Hamas will have new military capacity. Most Israelis do not want to abandon the Philadelphia corridor. And most Israelis do want some kind of a deal, but not at Hamas's conditions. And so we have polls that all the different partisans, this has become such a political question, we have polls that all these different partisans have just been taking to these very different directions. Just to name 2 polls as an example, there is a poll out there, I believe by Channel 12, put out on Friday, that 63% of Israelis support a deal and 12% oppose. And then there is a very big online poll by a Telegram account that is very popular among Israelis and that has Israelis from across the political spectrum that shows that 81% oppose. And there's allegedly a direct poll out today, which went up and then went down, and I'm not sure what's happening with it. Maybe there are faults in it, but that show overwhelming support for Netanyahu's position. Direct polls is owned by a former aide to Netanyahu, and it's a right-wing pollster, but he's a right-wing pollster whose numbers have basically been good over the last few election cycles. And they show overwhelming opposition to withdrawal from Philadelphia and to a deal. And what's really interesting is that when you take a look at the actual questions being asked, Israelis are not saying whether they like or don't like a deal. What they're saying is whether they agree to Hamas's conditions or don't agree to Hamas's conditions. So a deal that shows 63% support to 12% opposition was a deal that says, where the question was, do you support or oppose a hostage deal that was agreed upon at the Qatar summit or something like that? In other words, the deal Israel agreed to, or may agree to, or kind of agreed to, would that be okay? And 63% said yes. And the Telegram poll that said 81% said no to a deal, the actual question was, do you support a deal under Hamas's conditions? 81% said no. That is not a way of polling whether people support or oppose a deal. That's a way of polling whether people want Hamas to win the negotiations on the deal or Israel to win the negotiations on the deal. So it's very hard to tell where the public stands, except to say, the public doesn't know much and doesn't get into the details. But the public is tormented. We could talk about that. There's the IDI poll that came out today. The public is tormented. The public wants the hostages out. The public wants a deal desperately, but the public is not willing to pay the costs for a deal that might be Hamas's, minimum.
Our prime minister tends to frame what's going on right now in terms of the greater good of the nation, not versus the individual, but he appears to be directing his energies and his explanations why he wants to, for example, remain in the Philadelphia corridor with this eye towards the greater good. And that's what you want a leader to do versus what a parent of a hostage would do, for sure. And in this mix, of course, is the fact that some of the hostages were soldiers versus some of them, most of them, were civilians. As the parent of a soldier, I made a contract with the state when I handed my children over. Not that I had a choice, of course. And my children made a contract with the nation as well, taking an oath that they would defend the nation even with their lives. My husband and I cried when we heard our first fighter, our daughter, say that just a few months ago. These are also in the mix, I think, that we're talking about soldiers versus civilians, the greater good versus the good of right now. How do you break that up in terms of this potential hostage release deal, if there, as you said, is even one that is acceptable to both sides on the table?
Look, we've seen over the last 11 months an astonishing willingness to sacrifice and to fight across the political spectrum. Right now, we have polls out of people asking, do you think we're doing well in Gaza? And it's about divided, half and half. Think that the war is not being run well in Gaza and are fairly pessimistic about our ability to defeat and destroy and eliminate Hamas from Gaza. And for different reasons. These are not two sides. There's about 11 sides. But then when you go to the north, you go to the question of Hezbollah, which has been rocketing us for 11 months and destroyed entire kibbutzim slowly, and most of the north is depopulated. You suddenly find 67% support for intensifying the war in the north. So the very Israelis growing tired in Gaza, they're not growing tired because they're unwilling to fight. They're growing tired because they're not sure the leadership has a path to win, to victory. And in the north, they think that we can hit back much harder, and they're willing to go there. And we're talking about 67% of the population. We're talking about the parents and of the soldiers. We're talking about the soldiers themselves. We're talking about populations that are going to sacrifice, not populations that are thinking about this in some abstract way.
This idea, Haviv, of living alongside the conflict, with having a low-boil conflict all the time, this is, of course, from the foundation of the state. And so I think perhaps it's time to reconsider this idea. I mean, it's definitely the traditional thinking of so many Israelis, those that you quoted inside this poll that you just cited, could be among them. But the question is, okay, the hostage release deal goes to a ceasefire, even a final ceasefire, but there is no such thing as a final ceasefire, as we all know, because within even a week or a day, it could be abrogated, and there we are, boom, back to it. So this is kind of my quandary right now, because obviously as a mother, as a feeling person, every life is sacred. I want everyone back home right now. But then I wonder about, I have 3 soldiers right now. What about the 4 other children who will one day also join the army, and their children and their children's children if we still have a state? I like so many people here in Israel, I'm confused, I'm depressed. I feel like there has to be some kind of change in thinking.
I've asked a lot of Israelis that basic question over the last 11 months. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of very different kinds of Israelis. And because we have polls showing that morale is declining. And I want to know why. Our enemies are doing worse than us, put it that way. And our enemies, in order to hurt us, have to destroy themselves. What Hezbollah, Gaza obviously, but what Hezbollah is doing to Lebanon is just a slow-moving version of Yemen. And so why do we feel as though, right, we're the party that's somehow not doing well? And the answer is always, always leadership. It's always about trust in leadership. We are Jews. It's hard for Anglophone Jews to notice this, to remember this, because we are in touch with sort of the cultural assumptions of the English-speaking Jewish diaspora, which is 90% of the diaspora, and remembers a very different 20th century than the Jews who became Israel. But the Jews who became Israel had to live on their sword every day and every hour, and that need to live on their sword was a tremendous blessing, because before they lived on their sword, they died, and their dying stopped when they began to live on their sword. And so, yes, we have enemies who think that the redemption of the world depends on our destruction. We have enemies who see their own imperialist interest in the region, taking over the region, as pushed back, as prevented by our existence. And those enemies will stop at nothing, including destroying whole nations of their own side, what we think of as their side, but they don't actually care about these people, in order to destroy us. And it has always been so. This, the Pan-Arab coalition against us in the 50s and 60s was basically fundamentally similar in terms of the scale of the threat. And we can handle it, and we can handle it fairly easily, but it feels bad. It feels depressing. It feels like there's no better future ahead of us. It feels like the horizon will be worse. And when you ask Israelis, why do you think the horizon will be worse? About 90 seconds into the conversation, you get into the culture wars. But not because of what Iran is doing, not because of what Hamas is doing, but because they are divided on, why does my son spend 200 days in Gaza and a Haredi child not? Why is the money being distributed the way it's being distributed with coalition money? Why do people with very extreme views for some reason control the police? And the sense that this is a government that in economic indicators and in certain policy indicators, I don't want to get into too much, but just like most Israelis supported some kind of reform of the judiciary without any details. But when you just polled them 2 years ago, do you think the judiciary needs a reform? 70% said yes. And then the government's version of that reform was so extreme, and the rhetoric and the bills that the government presented in the beginning of 2023 were so crazy, criminalizing women wearing improper clothing at the Western Wall to the point of prison time, was a bill presented while the Supreme Court was being massively weakened by the coalition. And people said, this government's at war with us. It's at war with me and my lifestyle and my way of life and thinking. And so the sense that we are a nation set against itself is the source of the despair. I don't want to speak to what you feel, but I guess that would be my question to you. Are you actually afraid of the enemy, or is the question, do you, for example, the IDI poll today, I think the exact number is 39% of Israelis, when they're asked about it, most Israelis agree with Netanyahu that we don't pull out of the Philadelphia corridor. And 39% think that every decision he's making is a political one and not actually about the war. The distrust is the collapse in morale, not the enemies.
I think it's possible to hold many things at the same time. And of course, to have a really poor memory like I do and maybe forget how I felt yesterday. But I think for me personally, part of what worries me so deeply is that I believe with certainty that our enemies are taking a very long-term view and see the Jewish state as a blip in this region and will sacrifice swaths of people, maybe an entire people, in order to drive the Jews out of this area. So I have this in my head, and a lot of the factual surrounding of our nation by these Iranian proxies tends to support my theory. But I have this all the time in my head, but also what you're saying about the divisiveness. And of course, you can't escape the terrible inflammatory language that is being used by both sides of the issue among Israelis in terms of get the hostages out now or maintain deterrence or try to build back deterrence. It's just ripping us apart for sure.
Yeah. And that's, by the way, that's exactly what the polls say. In other words, you are a very normal.
Wow, finally.
Sorry to tell you that. I know it's a horrible thing to hear, but a very normal Israeli. So the IDI poll asks optimism, just the basic question, are you optimistic? And Jewish Israelis are overwhelmingly pessimistic about a chance for a ceasefire that leads to a release of hostages. 78.5% say no. You can't be pessimistic about the chance for a ceasefire and also happy. A chance to get the hostages out, not a ceasefire, and also happy. So even people who say there's no way we can give them Philadelphia and therefore there won't be a deal, and that's a price I'm willing to pay, but nobody's happy about that. Not ordinary people. In other words, odd screaming banshees on cable television maybe, but not real people. And a lot of Israelis think that it's the last chance to get them out. 44% say this is it. We don't get them out now. And we're not going to get them out now because Hamas's price is too high. It's almost like the point of optimism is in the deep pessimism. Hamas has set that price too high. And Netanyahu has a reasonable argument. His opponents and their distrust is also very reasonable. The fact that for 8 months we didn't go into Philadelphia, the fact that for the entire hostage negotiation process, Philadelphia wasn't central, and now suddenly it's central. And done in a way last week at the cabinet meeting where he surprises the army, surprises the defense. There's so much politicking happening around it, which I find as horrifying as, the half of Israelis that distrusts Netanyahu. But that doesn't mean he's wrong. And it doesn't mean most Israelis don't think he's right, even the ones who distrust him. And so at the end of the day, Hamas is asking for a price that we can't pay. And all of our internal divides and weaknesses doesn't matter. We can't pay the price that they're demanding. And I submit to you that that's a kind of liberation because Hamas has taken it too far. If we can't get the hostages out, we have no reason to negotiate and no reason to let Hamas live because they're not holding the lives of hostages over us. And that's good militarily. And if we move forward in that way, there is some chance that Hamas will realize that and lower that cost. And if there isn't a chance, they're not coming out. And almost 80% of Israelis think that's the end result. They're not coming out, that this is it. So I call that optimism. I don't know.
I think one of the questions, Haviv, that I have is whether Israelis in general consider themselves part of the collective, right? I talked about this oath taking that all soldiers, at least fighters, have to take. And they say willingly that they agree to give up their lives for the country. But of course, you are demobbed and you leave the army. And so that oath that you took and received your gun and a Bible, does that oath still play a role in your head when you're making decisions such as this? And when you're sitting as a hostage captive for 336 days?
I have no idea what's going through the head of a hostage. They're very different kinds of people also, from very different tracks of life and ages and cultures within Israeli society. I just don't know what's going on in the heads of the hostages. I think I know what's happening to ordinary Israelis back in Israel. I think that sense of solidarity absolutely holds. I think you saw that in the military call-up, and I think you saw that even now, we're falling back into the divisive politics, for which I tend to blame the people in power, but it's not like the other side is different in fundamental ways. And when they will come to power, they probably will also play those kinds of politics. So we're falling back. Still, Israelis are making, in the polls, hard, painful decisions. They are deeply there with the hostages. They are deeply, not confused, but they're ambiguous about how we move forward in different things, on different questions of Philadelphia, not Philadelphia. There's a lot of middle ground, a lot of gray area, and they are deeply committed to the country. I'll give you one example, again, from the same poll. The Israel Democracy Institute poll from today, just in case people want to look it up. The New York Times reported an American official, this was the poll question, saying that Israel has achieved all it can militarily in Gaza. So I asked Israelis, did Israel achieve all it can militarily in Gaza? Are we just standing there doing nothing? 64% said no. And among the Jews, it's much higher. Another 64% was the total sample. 64% said no. Slightly higher among Jews, 67% than among Arabs, 52%. But generally 2/3 of Israeli Jews and very nearly 2/3 of Israelis, because quite a few, more than half of Arabs, think that there's more to do in Gaza, more that can be done, that we will get out of Hamas. So there's an optimism, a willingness, huge numbers of people who deeply distrust this government, support this government's argument on Philadelphia. And so that tells me that there's also a seriousness and a substantiveness to how Israelis are thinking about the future in Gaza. And there's a willingness to beat Hezbollah to a bloody pulp, and more willingness arguably among the public than among the government. So no, I don't think that solidarity ends. I was a soldier once. I did for a couple of decades, a month reserve duty. I feel that commitment and that devotion, and I don't think my country can do no wrong. I think it constantly does wrong. I spend most of my time complaining about it. But the basic solidarity and sense that we are there for each other and defend each other, that's still, in every poll where we can measure it seriously, crosses all the lines, and Israelis prove in their actions that they still feel it.
Let's talk a little bit more about the problems within the echelon of the leadership. And a lot of the inflammatory language starts from the top, I would say. And of course, it's echoed and repeated and improved upon in many situations by regular people. But you and I have discussed several times how the coalition is basically stable right now. That Ben Gvir isn't going to leave, that the Haredim aren't going to leave. They have no better offer. And the only thing that could push the government out is probably the budget, but they're working on the budget, even though, of course, Smotrich this week showed up at a press conference pretty much unprepared. But the budget would be the next obstacle. That's months down the road. And so I think my question is basically, why is there no longer the sense in the political echelon that they're working towards the day after? And it's all, at least from what I'm hearing, about tearing each other down right now, even though there is no horizon for new elections. That all this talk of new elections is such a smoke and mirrors kind of situation, it appears to me.
I think the question of the budget is sort of symbolic. The government really there was a sense of doom and gloom in the government. And you saw that with the cowardice of a lot of ministers who wouldn't speak for a long time or spoke very strangely. They wouldn't support the prime minister openly, but then they wouldn't oppose him openly. And you had a lot of that over the last 11 months. A lot of Likud ministers do everything they can, and even Shas and UTJ and ministers do everything they can to avoid cameras. There was a funeral of a soldier in Gaza who was the son of the executive director of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset, a well-known person, quite loved person in the political system, very competent, has been there many years, and his son was killed in battle in Gaza. And because this person is the top professional of the most secretive and also maybe important committee in the Knesset, oversees the war in the army and the national security issues, ministers who knew him for many years came to the funeral of his son. And they came to the part where you stand in the back and there's some family sort of mourns and gives eulogies. And then the part where the people who came accompany the family to the actual grave and actually bury this soldier, they fled. They were terrified, these ministers, of being caught by regular crowd walking to the grave, because they know how much anger there is, and they know how much distrust, and they know their own behavior caused a lot of it. So I'll give you an example from my own experience, talking to members of Kibbutz Nir Oz. A quarter of Nir Oz was killed or kidnapped, and on October 7. And they've invited ministers, and they've invited Netanyahu. And I haven't kept a tally. I don't know if some junior minister visited at any point, but Netanyahu won't. And they know it, and they feel it. And that sense that these people, even in these moments, even in the past 11 months, have never not campaigned, have never not had an eye out for the camera angle, have never not actually just been there with everybody.
Yeah, but Haviv, I'm actually talking more about the opposition, because the government is in power. They should feel secure, I feel like. But the opposition, instead of rising above, instead of working towards the next day, is really, I don't know, going down to the most base level and just with the name calling and the I won't shake your handing and all of the stuff like that. There's no horizon on the political future for any kind of alternative at this point.
Yeah, the opposition, on the one hand, should in theory be free. It can't be blamed for October 7. It had very little time in power over the last 15 years, and the fundamental strategy and policy of Gaza belonged to the parties that are now the coalition. And so they could be riding all of the anger, all of the distrust, all of the frustration, which you hear from Likud voters, quite a few, if you sit down and talk to them properly. But they aren't. They are divided. They are run by, frankly, I'm just looking at it from the side, incompetent, political managers. They're all trying to maneuver against each other as much as against the government. In some ways, that has to be so. I mean, they're too diverse. Culturally, politically, a lot of the opposition is Arab parties. They have very little in common with Gantz's party in terms of policy, in terms of seeing, other than disagreeing with Netanyahu, which is not a lot of policy overlap there. They don't share any agenda with, Gantz or Saar or even Lapid. So, the opposition is divided, arguably poorly led, and unable to take advantage politically of the moment. I think, look, because this coalition is so threatened, because it hasn't won a single poll basically since January of last year, it's very, very stable. And that's a truth of parliamentary systems generally. As the polling numbers decline, coalitions become more stable because nobody wants to face the voter. And so Ben-Gvir could blow up this government if Bibi gives an inch to Hamas in something, but what's he going to do then? Sit out of power for 5 years for no reason? Smotrich knows the exact same thing that Ben-Gvir knows. Shas is desperate for this government to survive because the government that will replace it will wreak havoc on Haredi budgets. The Haredi community, because of the particular welfare state that they built, I think unwisely, but what do I know, is utterly dependent on special government funding beyond the regular welfare state, or they decline into poverty. Or even worse, huge numbers of their men have to go work. Even worse, literally in their mind and the way they talk about it. That was not meant sarcastically. That's how their rabbis discuss this issue. And so, nobody can leave this coalition. So it's quite stable. They're going to have to pass a budget that's very painful. It'll have major cuts. Netanyahu and Smotrich have already met and tried to figure out how to not cut the budget, but in fact create what they call boxes, which is just a way of talking about deficit spending while pretending to still be responsible, because outside of the box, which is special spending, we heard that term a lot in COVID, right? We're going to do a special tens of billions of shekel spending, and then there's the budget next to it, which is still responsible. And you're like, okay, but those are both spending of from the same bank account, right? So they're talking about creating these special boxes, and the reason is wartime. There's still extra spending on the ultra-Orthodox welfare state while there's wartime spending box. So it's not just about wartime. It's a lot of it about holding together the coalition. But Netanyahu is willing to spend that money. He's willing to deficit spend significantly in order to put together that budget, survive until the 2026 election. And in 2026, as we say in Hebrew, God is great. Only God knows, right? The future is very complex. And so it is a stable coalition. I say that it could be felt tomorrow morning by Ben-Gvir going crazy. I don't know. And he has done some things that are very foolish for him, some things that looked foolish at first and turned out to be very good politics. He's a little bit unpredictable. Netanyahu is very frustrated about that. But it could be felt at any minute by any one of the party leaders. But at the moment, it is very stable. The budget is quite likely to pass. They're doing everything necessary for that to happen. And so 2025 is still going to have this government in place. We just passed a week that was probably the most likely week yet in 11 months in which there was a chance that we would see the 2 million Israelis taking to the streets, shutting down the country and demanding the government's resignation. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen not because there wasn't the anger. It didn't happen because Israelis don't actually want it to leave the Philadelphia corridor. And that's what the fight was actually about. And so it didn't happen on substance. So Netanyahu hasn't failed badly enough. Most Israelis think he's not done that well in the war, but not badly enough for replacing him in elections in the middle of a war to be justified. That is the feeling among most Israelis. And on this specific question of this particular dust-up, for all the torment and genuine pain, and a third of Israelis just think he's an absolute criminal who, for his politics, is leaving people to die. But 2/3 do not, and they don't think he's wrong on Philadelphia. So that's where things stand. There's not going to be a big political... It's terrible for a political analyst to say something so specific and clear, because if I'm wrong, but it doesn't look like there's going to be any major political upset in the near future, in the next few months at least.
Haviv, thank you as usual for joining me today.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.